Welcome everyone
Hello.
to our second faculty development workshop. This was our second workshop of two in this series. Grayson, when you have a moment, can you spotlight me and our presenters? So I'm Bree Schmidt, and I am the Curriculum and Assessment Specialist for undergraduate education here in CCAPS. Tony, unfortunately, was not able to be here today, so I have the good fortune of introducing our panelists and sharing questions that are coming from our faculty and academic teams here in CCAPS. Our session today is on uh, feedback, providing prompt, meaningful, and actionable feedback to students. So we'll welcome our panelists here. Let's start with Leanne Godfrey. Welcome, Leanne. Will you share a little bit about yourself with our community here, as well as your role?
Sure, thanks, Bree. So I'm Leanne Godfrey. I work in MELP, which is the Minnesota English Language Program. It's one of the CCAPS programs. And my role here is faculty liaison. So I support faculty and staff across the university in better serving our international and multilingual students. And I run a number of workshops and a cohort this semester about fostering international and multilingual student success in higher ed. And I'm really here to kind of just bring a perspective of working with the international and multilingual students. So thanks for having me.
Welcome, Leanne. Thank you for spending your lunch time with us. Dan.
I'm Dan Emery, and I work in writing across the curriculum. And there are two parts of my job. One is the Teaching with Writing program, which is for all faculty across campus on using writing in their courses. And the other is the Writing Enriched curriculum, which involves working with particular departments. And so I have the good fortune of working with construction management, ITI, and health service management faculty on bringing meaningful writing assignments into their classes and making those things work.
Well, welcome, Peter.
Well, right on, Dan. Couldn't resist that joke. I'm Peter Hilger, faculty director of the construction management program. Been teaching around these places for 27 years now. So I'm really passionate about writing and feedback and hope to contribute something to this panel. And Leanne, with 3 international students, I just escorted 15 high school students from Costa Rica around campus. Just got back a few minutes ago. So love those international students. And Francis and I just come back from Costa Rica ourselves. So
Awesome. Welcome, Peter. And then we are also joined by Jennifer Weigelt.
Sorry, I took my mute off. Hi, I'm Jennifer Weigelt. I'm a core faculty member of the Integrated Behavioral Health Program in CCAPS, so we call it IBH. Also have the addictions counseling. I almost called it addiction studies, but we don't say that anymore. But it still has the ADDS. So if you see that, we have a combined program of the ADDS and IBH programs. I'm a core faculty member in teaching there. I'm a clinical psychologist, so I also do clinical practice, but also teach in the program.
Wonderful. Welcome. Well, now that we have introductions of all of our panelists, we'll start with some questions. So what ideas, values, and/or resources influence your thinking about providing student feedback? And Peter, how about we start with you?
oh my. What factors influence giving feedback? Well, the biggest one of all is the thirst for feedback by students. In the absence of feedback, teaching becomes ineffective. And I find that, at least for my students, that they really want the feedback, good, bad, and ugly, as it comes, but meaningful feedback beyond just a score that represents something. And so that's the biggest thing, is they need it. They have to have it in order to make connections.
Leanne, what are ideas, values, or resources that are influencing your thinking about student feedback right now?
Sure, thanks. I think some of the things that I think about is like, does it support growth and learning? So in what ways does the feedback that I give students support the student learning outcomes and what it is that they're meant to be like what we're trying to help them learn. And so does it promote that? The others is, does it align? So I think that's similar, but does it support the student learning, but also does it align with the curriculum, with the student learning outcomes, as I mentioned before? And then I think another thing that I'm really thinking about a lot these days is when I'm looking at student work, what cultural frames am I looking at the student work with? And so how is that framing what I'm expecting from them? And then if it's not aligning, right, what might be cultural frames that students are working from or within? And maybe sometimes there's a misalignment. So maybe there are some really great ideas, but they're not in writing, for example, and I'm gonna let Dan talk more about that, but like they may not be presented where I'm expecting them to be presented, or things may not be coming at me in the ways that I'm expecting because our cultural frames or our expectations are slightly different. So I'm thinking a lot about like how that might be impacting student work and the kind of feedback that I'm giving them. So I'll stop there. I have more to say, but I'll let others go on. And I can.
All right. And figuring out how to best facilitate this panel. Dan and Jennifer, I'd love to hear your perspectives as well. In the next questions, I'll just ask the question and we'll kind of go from there. I don't necessarily want to call on folks. So, but Dan and Jennifer, where are you at with ideas, values, and resources that are influencing your thinking right now?
One of the things that this is something that's important, I think, in our field. Like I said, I'm a psychologist, so I'm training people to be new therapists, they're counselors. And so I'm always keenly aware of bridging that scholar practitioner model of teaching our students how to take what they're learning in the classroom and apply it to their clinical practice. But also the other way around is like, how do we learn best in clinical practice? How are we expecting people to learn? Because that's where so much of their learning is going to occur. And I've now started thinking about how do I apply those learning methods in the classroom? So I think about all the ways in which I've learned best over the years in the different ways in which student learns. And like even being a therapist, writing reports, writing papers, I will give these examples about how my colleagues and I can have similar thoughts. We can both do a really good job, but we have very different styles of writing. We have different ways of doing things, and that those are all appreciated. So I like to have show and showcase like different styles of writing while still doing a really good job, different ways of doing something, even different opinions about something, but still both being good. And using those kinds of lenses and frameworks in how I give feedback in the classroom versus like, this is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is better. But like, look at these different ways of doing something that are all have their strengths and maybe some missed opportunities, but they're different, yet both good examples. So that's something that I kind of look at in terms of how I'm structuring the feedback I'm giving in my classrooms.
I think I just mentioned on the last category, the resources category, there's a really rich scholarship on providing feedback to students and strategies for feedback that can be most effective. One of my absolute faves is Dana Ferris and her book, A Response to Student Writing Implications for Second Language Students. It's one of those just absolutely classical books at this point. It's 2003, so the fact that it's 20 years old, I think is, in this case, a testament to its enduring quality, where she really looks at what kinds of feedback strategies are most effective for working with multilingual students in terms of what gets them to make changes and revisions in their writing. I'm also a big fan of Richard Straub. His book, Response to Student Writing, is also absolutely fantastic. And I think the middle term that Bree introduced was resources. Resources was the last one. I think it was values. I think a dialogue or reciprocity is probably the most important value that comes along with feedback, is that feedback isn't telling students what to do, it's asking them questions so that they decide what to do.
If I could just build on real quickly what Dan said, I think one of the other things that I think about with feedback is just like, how does it build in reflection, right? How does it encourage students to really reflect on what they've done and make as Dan said, make choices and how they want to do things differently or reaffirm what they've done. Yes.
A question that came up from our instructor community that relates to this, I think, idea around values and climate is how can instructors foster a climate where feedback is treated as a gift rather than maybe a criticism?
Well, I'll dive in on that. One of the techniques that I use for feedback is feedback that I don't give, but that I elicit from the student, the peer group within the classroom. So, for example, especially related to writing, but not necessarily to writing, any sort of issue that may come up in an assignment will use as a discussion point in class. And after that discussion, we have the ability to then ask the students to self-reflect on that. Did the discussion influence how they might have changed their responses? And if they can meaningfully do that, that is say, I never thought about this. That was a really good idea. And then to write it down and turn it into me as their reflection. That's, in my opinion, that's the best feedback that I can't give, that they generated themselves. Is just the self-reflection piece. I think that's what you were getting to, Leanne.
One thing that brought to mind to me was the value of early feedback. When you get feedback at the end at the same time as the grade, it's difficult to suggest that the feedback is the piece that's meaningful, because students, rightly and wrongly, are truly motivated by their grades and scores. So opportunities for feedback toward improvement while the student is in process with their work, I think that's the gift-giving feedback, and that's the feedback that is potentially the most valuable. I mean, we give feedback and students earn grades is one of the sort of glib ways that you might describe it. So that the feedback is really about the process of dialogue over student improvement. The grade is the thing where we have to provide some kind of assessment. I think in the research literature, this is sometimes described as the difference between descriptive feedback and evaluative feedback. Descriptive feedback is what's going well, what do you need to work on? Evaluative feedback is how did I respond, or how did the student respond to a set of determined criteria, or how well is it a fit for the expectations of the assignment.
Leanne, I'm wondering oh, I'm sorry, Jennifer, were you gonna?
No, it's okay. I was just thinking, I mean, along those lines, one of the things I do, I mean, depending on the class, but I do, so along those same lines, offer times for people to choose to meet with me and submit portions of their work for feedback should they choose. And so I certainly have students who will take advantage of that. And they'll see feedback as a gift. The other thing I do is I have like assignment windows. So I give them a long window for which assignment can be due. And if they submit it earlier in that window, if they choose to, they'll get more feedback because they have more time. Like when people, I have 10 papers submitted on the day it's due, and they can take that feedback should they choose and resubmit it. And for additional work if they want as well. And then they get to control where they want to fall in that.
So it sounds like you're providing them some choices, and in that contributing to this climate where feedback, as Dan was sharing, is not exclusively viewed as evaluative, but at some points actually is also beneficial in its ability to describe and connect with students as they're developing their work. Leanne, I'm wondering, since your view is in working with international students and scholars and multicultural or multilingual, or both?
Yeah.
Both. I'm wondering about that kind of climate around feedback and how, in the work that you do with international, multilingual, and multicultural students, how is that feedback maybe received differently based on the student's background?
mean, I think one thing we can do is talk about feedback. Like, what is the like? And I think one of the questions that we were asked to think about is what is the purpose of feedback? And so I think being explicit around our philosophies with our students, like, okay, in this class, this is how I'm seeing feedback. This is what I hope you're doing with it. How have you received feedback in the past? And so it may be some norming around, like just understanding, like what has been the feedback culture in their previous experiences, and like having a conversation around that, and then kind of norming that or normalizing, right? The what you're going to be doing in the classroom or what you're hoping to do and how everyone can contribute to that. And so I think especially like in classes where there's peer feedback, I think we need to create spaces where students are understanding the purpose of it, and that that we're hoping that it's a dialogue, that we're not seeing it, especially in some circles, like the instructor is meant to give like direction versus suggestion, right? And so how is that, like, is the feedback something I have to do? Is the feedback something I'm supposed to do, I should think about? So really being clear about what the intentions are. And then the more you're kind of doing it, I think the more you normalize it, then the more like it becomes a space where students can talk about it and give it to each other, and um take it and use it and those kinds of things. And so those are just some things that come to mind.
I appreciate that perspective, because oftentimes there are hidden curriculums in higher ed, and feedback, whether for all students, the purpose of feedback, the culture of feedback, may not be clear to students who, that kind of curriculum becomes hidden about what is the purpose of feedback. So I appreciate that. It's universal approach to address the purpose of feedback globally within a classroom.
Well, oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, like, how many times, like, I saw in the most recent class that I've taught where there's quite a bit of feedback was research writing for the American University. It was a class for international students in our MELT program and first year students. So a lot of them were their first experience. They take it before they take first year writing. And a lot of times in my feedback, I'm asking questions like, oh, what a great idea here. Like, and then I'll ask a question as a way to prompt thinking, a way to prompt reflection. And then I'll get feedback from the students are like, okay, I answered your question, or like, oh, you didn't see, I answered your question. I'm waiting, and they're waiting for feedback. And yes, that is the idea of a dialogue, but the way that Canvas is set up, I don't have notifications when they respond to my comments. So there's a lot of like one-ended conversations, but they also aren't realizing that, like, okay, when I ask a question, it's not meant, you don't have to answer all the questions for me. It's really meant to get you and to support you in your thinking and in your decision making. And so that's where I think I could probably work on being more clear with my students as to when I write. It's not always meant that you have to respond to me specifically to then continue.
I think it's also true that a lot of the foreign students come from an academic program that is very highly focused on points as opposed to feedback. I know this in a lot of European universities. It's all about the points. And there's so much of an emphasis on that sometimes the feedback needs to be nuanced a little bit when you come from that framework where you're so highly dependent on the points. I don't know if you've seen that, Leah.
Yeah, I mean, and also sometimes some of the students are here on scholarship or on sponsored visas, and so they are concerned about their points in the United States because their programs or their scholarships are like, I had a whole group of students last semester that in their first semester they had to have a 3.75, which is a high GPA when you're in a new culture, far away from everybody that in a new academic setting, in a new language, like that's a really high. And so they were very concerned about points because it meant they could lose their scholarships. So it's sometimes the prior educational experiences, but sometimes it's just the stipulations of their visas or their.
Yeah.
So I think this is a good segue into another question is, how do you balance providing feedback and grading with other teaching obligations?
I have to remind myself that feedback and grading is teaching.
Yes.
And we think about it that way. Some days I might have to prioritize preparing my classroom space, and some days I might have to, and some days that the task that really needs to be addressed and what the students are really needing is some quality feedback, and that's going to have to take more of my time. And so, and if I think about like the feedback as a way of socializing students into a particular discipline or into a particular practice, or supporting their growth there, I think they should be on equal footing, even though it doesn't always feel that way. But yeah. I don't know if it answers the question, but it's a good reminder sometimes. It's not in addition to teaching. It is part of teaching. It is part of the process.
Yeah. When I think the other part of your question is, what is the other? The other requirements of our appointments, it seems like teaching is and feedback is everything. And preparation for it is what has to happen before we get into class. And hopefully we've advanced it far enough that we're fully prepared for how to handle that feedback session when we're in class. As opposed to just when we're sitting in front of our screens grading stuff that's just come in. I think feedback starts in the classroom. That's why I particularly like the flipped model of teaching, where we're not doing as much lecturing in the class, that we can deliver that externally through, technology, but that we can talk about what it is that they've learned and then apply assignments that we can actually discuss in class, where the feedback becomes most meaningful and group oriented.
Oh, hi, Jennifer. I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I would say for me, I would fully acknowledge that giving feedback is very much a part of teaching in my job, and I will also acknowledge it's very, very time consuming. And so, although it's really important, I'm also keenly aware that the more time in a row, more minutes in a row I spend grading, the quality of my grading can go down. And so I'm keenly just pay attention to that. And so there's things that I try to do to limit those kinds of biases from the feedback that I give, because I'm human. And once I'm on hour 2 of reading the paper, I start to get fatigued. I mean, yes, it's a part of my job, but it's still difficult. And so some of the things that I try to do, one is grade in different orders all the time. So I start in different places on the roster and grade papers so that I'm not always grading the same person first and grading the last person last. So I start in different places to make sure everybody's getting the best of me at some point. I hate to say that, but the longer I do it, I do start to fatigue, right? The other thing is I try to do is find themes in people's work and provide group feedback. So I'll notice that people who are losing points or are struggling in a certain section tend to have some themes around that. So instead of spending all my time giving individual feedback, I'll start to identify themes in various aspects of the assignment, and I'll post some group feedback. Like, here's some of the strengths I saw in the assignments. Here's a lot of the strengths I saw that are really consistent across the board. I also noticed students who were struggling in this area or maybe had some missed opportunities tended around these 4 issues or these 2 issues. And lots of times students will, so I can give that feedback to the group, it saves me time and it keeps my quality high. And most of the time students can reflect on that and say, oh, I could see where I missed that opportunity. I could have added more about that. So those are some things that I try to do, is as much as I know, like, it's a part, it's those things that I do have to be aware of that will impact my ability to get quality feedback, is just my humanness will show after about 2 hours. So that's just some thoughts I have.
I want to echo the value of Jennifer's practice of reflecting with the whole group on the feedback. So talking about trends that you notice, this is one of the things that I do very often when I'm giving students their papers back or when I'm, recording some grades. I always want to make sure that there's a debrief that's associated with the entire class as well as that individualized student feedback. I think of my ideal university would involve as much feedback as possible and as little grading as possible. And but the structures of the university don't always lend themselves to that. One thing that I think is true is that there are very few shortcuts to good feedback, but there are plenty of shortcuts to efficient grading. So things like rubrics or like pass-fail assignments or specifications grading, I think all of those can pull back on some of the burden of the grading bit And I think separating the responding to student writing from the grading of student writing also just makes the responding feel better. So it's, not, oh, I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times. It's really separating those two things. Grading schemes that are simple and transparent and where students' expectations are clear. I think that if we hit those, then we have very little to worry about when it comes to grading.
Just to kind of build on some of this, the kind of reusing some of the feedback and like some comments that are come up regularly in Canvas, if you do speed grader and you do a rubric, but you don't have, you like you have just the criteria, but not the points for each one, then you can give free comments on each criteria and you can save those. And so then you go to the next student and all your previous comments show up. And so you can just select it. And so that's helpful if like there's common reoccurring things that I can use. So that's helpful just for more like broad strokes kinds of things. And then the other thing that I try to do to remind myself is just like the students can't focus on everything either. And so if I just try to find like, okay, this past assignment, the real big like skills or things that students should be trying to implement at this point or whatever are these. And so that's, I'll try to really focus my feedback on a few things versus on everything, because it's overwhelming for both of them and me. Yes, prioritized. Yeah.
I basically do the same thing. I call it global feedback. So students are used to seeing my global feedback that I also have a rubric, but the rubric isn't necessarily tied to the final grade, but there is sort of a points to it, but it does give some clarity to the sort of the quality of the assignment as the first level of feedback. Then I do my global feedback, and then I give an individual feedback. So there's usually on any assignment, there's 3 levels, and the individual is mainly to target, oh, you got so close on this item, or if just think about this the next time you do this assignment or whatever. I think if the students get that sort of multi-level of feedback down to the personal, even if it's 1 or 2 sentences on the personal, that still is pretty significant meaning for the student to know that you took at least a moment to comment on something personal, even to say good job.
One of the other things I'll just say that's kind of my favorite thing to do is I highlight student work. So I always let them opt in. So I talk about at the beginning of class that one of the best and most efficient ways for me to give really good feedback is to learn from other people's work. And so I'll say is when I find work that I find good, I'd like to highlight that. And I'd like to spend some time sharing with the class what was some good, like some things that I thought were strengths and also maybe some areas of missed opportunity. That's why everybody knows nothing's perfect. That's fine. And so I will select different student work. So usually I'll pick 2 to 3 students each time and pick their work. And I like to pick work that's different from each other. So there's different writing styles, different tones, different things like that. So they see like, this is still a good paper, but it's a different style of writing. This person has some different types of ways they do something. And I'll say, here's the things I thought were strengths of this one. Here's where some of maybe the missed opportunities of this one. I think students like it. It makes me give, as peers are like, that was super helpful to see a good example of that. And then and so they'll always, their papers subsequently get better. So it's working, but also I think they have some pride in having their work showcased. And so there's kind of this, like, I'll walk into class and they're like, hey, congratulations to one of their peers who I picked their work. But like I said, I try to move around in the room or in the class so everyone has an opportunity to have some work showcased. Someone have to really try hard to not, right, to not do something, but and really making an effort to make sure that somebody has that throughout the time. But I find that a good way to give efficient group feedback.
Mm-hmm. I do something very similar, Jennifer, but I don't select ahead of time. We select the day that they submit and we randomize the selection. And so that produces some interesting results because nobody knows who's going to be selected. And it just reflects our industry is that sometimes you don't have a choice who gets to see what you've written. And I try to emphasize that as a sort of a important piece of feedback. But then we put the good, the bad, and the ugly up. And it's maybe a little risky for the one that's ugly, but it's certainly those are the ones that teach the most. in a lot of ways. So just a thought.
Well, speaking of risky strategies, I think there are new strategies that are brought to our attention as instructors and educators frequently. So one that comes to mind is ungrading for me, and I'm curious to learn from you all of what strategies for promoting student learning with feedback are you currently using, or strategies that excite you? What are the ones that are maybe pushing into new territory in terms of evolving how student feedback is used and how students are interacting with that feedback? What are strategies that are new or trying or exciting? Or if there are strategies that are debunked, I feel like Dan might be able to tell us debunked strategies. Maybe. What strategies come to mind? What are you trying? What are you playing with? What are you piloting?
One thing I've been trying is in building in, so trying to build in more reflection. And I realize also in Canvas that students, so I always have a video of like how they can find their feedback, because I'm realizing that like there's so many, like in Canvas, it comes in so many ways. Like if you have a rubric, there's feedback there. You can put the comments in the document itself, and then there's the comments box. And so, and I use them all, and sometimes just because it seems like, oh, right in that moment is where I need to give some feedback, or in the rubric, they're expecting something. And then like the comments is where I give something maybe more global. But one of the things I've started implementing is having students take a look. So it's an assignment. It's like, okay, go into that assignment, look at all the feedback that I've provided for you, or your peer, because we have peer feedback, your peer has provided for you. And like, what is like a question you have about the feedback? What is something you're going to do in response to the feedback? And so it just kind of helps ensure that they've looked at it, and it helps like just kind of build this like that it's meant for to help grow and to help develop, and that you should do something with it. And it also makes me maybe feel a little bit better that it's not just hours and hours spent going to the void. But I think it's been kind of nice and help in seeing what they pick up from it and what they're noticing from the feedback and what they're like, how they're applying it and stuff. So
One strategy I'll just sort of pipe up here, which I really like, and remember that it's not always about the writing. At least in our discipline, it's about the thoughts, not just the writing. The writing, unfortunately, sometimes is the only way to communicate those thoughts. But I use a combination of strategies, including discussion posts, which I really like a lot, where the students are providing feedback to each other, that required feedback in the discussion post, but usually on conceptual topics. So things that ask them to make decisions, things that ask them to evaluate a situation. That doesn't necessarily necessitate a written response, but requires a cerebral response. And I want to encourage that as well. So I know that the discussion posts do that. And then the afterthought, the feedback after we've gone through all of these different assignments, that there's that one piece that says, wrap it all up for me. Tell me what you're going to change about what we've discussed. Bring it all together, because that's where I believe the true learning comes, is when they can reflect on what it is they would have done differently.
That
One thing that
I was just going to say, that reminds me of a strategy that I think I learned from the Center for Writing, which is asking students to share writing memos of what they noticed and changed in their work. I found that to be a very useful strategy to understand where students are at, what they're making meaning of, for me to understand the impact of my feedback and what resonated. And I think, as Dan has shared, offering students opportunities to engage in their own agency around decision making in their writing. So Dan, what were you going to share?
I was going to mention that the ungrading and some other labor-based grading contracts and specifications grading, I think those are one set of questions around grading, which isn't the same as the set of questions around feedback. So I think I want to I want to respond to the feedback component of your question, but also point out that there are some new ways of thinking about grading that could be potentially beneficial. When people who study writing look at students' revision practices, it's pretty evident that there are three types of feedback that produce the most revision, where students are doing things differently and that it persists. And those three things are specific praise. Here's the good thing that you're doing, and here's why it's good. Explanation of here's something maybe you're misunderstanding. Here's a correction about how you might think about it. And then coaching. Here's how you might do this better with some kind of example or some kind of instruction about how to make a change. The feedback that produces the least amount of revision tends to be direct correction. I think many of us, when the comment feature in Microsoft Word came out, we got into the habit of putting a bunch of comments on a student document. And the tragedy of that is when the comments appear in the margins and all comments are marginal, they seem like they're of equivalent value. We really fail the test of creating priorities. And the student response might simply be, oh, accept all changes. I mean, no learning happens there. Even if you engage in extensive, copy editing, all you've done is demonstrated to the student that you're a good copy editor. You haven't taught them necessarily anything. So that kind of direct correction or criticism without coaching, like this sentence is unclear, isn't feedback that helps a lot. Like you could clarify this sentence by identifying the subject, identifying a different subject, or by Any of those sorts of strategies can be effective. So I think the how you say it component of feedback is really important. And I think if we're in a position of always coaching students to make changes in their own writing, it keeps the locus of control with students. That it's not you're writing to meet my expectations. It's you're writing to demonstrate what you know, what you think, what you believe.
All right, we have time for one more question. And I think this is a good question that could lead us into our instructor lounge. Are there any key words or phrases you find particularly helpful when providing feedback to students?
I would say the things I tend to do are strengths. So I'll say, here's the strengths and rationale. So like, here's the things that I thought were the strengths of this paper, not like, here's what you like. So, and I'll bullet point, here's some of the strengths and here's the rationale. Here's why I like that. This is how it's connected to the learning that we've been talking about. And then I'll use things like missed opportunities or areas of development. And so depending on the type of assignment, one might lend itself to being more appropriate than the other. So I'll use one of those and just kind of talk about what some of those are and just general themes about why I thought those are missed opportunities or areas of development. So I tend to use those two things or those three things, depending on the situation, when I give feedback.
I kind of follow the same strategy. Find what's good. Start with that, and then be constructive in your criticism, thereafter, by suggestion. I don't like to mandate how they should do things because I'm not going to be there to mandate it when they're working for industry. It's just not going to happen. So they need to think for themselves. And I just want to give them the inspiration that they can think for themselves. There's just maybe sometimes a little more deeply next time.
One thing that I do, and it may be a gimmick, but I also know that it works, is when I address the strengths of student work, I address it as a strength of the student. You do a nice job providing descriptive detail. When I address an area of improvement or a weakness, I typically ascribe it to the document. Your document will be more effective if you have citation of all of those pieces of evidence. So praise is to the person and criticism is to the document and process.
Right.
Again, totally a gimmick, right? It's just putting emphasis in the sentence where you want it to, but I think it can have motivating effects. I'd also say talk to your students about the grades. Ask students to tell you what they think. So after the first round of assessment, Give your students the opportunity to reflect on their performance. What did they think they did well? What did they think they need to improve on? Did they get the grade they expected? And how are they feeling about it? I think if you can have that kind of dialogue early on, it can be really useful.
Well, also to challenge you, you want to encourage them to challenge your comments, because actually sometimes they have some really good points. They just weren't able to articulate it as well, or that we didn't recognize the the uniqueness of their points when we're grading. Sometimes just having that one-on-one conversation with them after they got their grade and to be able to have that dialogue is more meaningful than just about anything. So yeah, definitely encourage them.
Some words that I would use in my feedback are things like audience, inform, and purpose. And Dan, connecting to your point around kind of removing a personal element to it, engaging students to think about the audience, and when we're writing to be understood, I think helps me to frame my feedback of, I'm not sure how, like maybe addressing how a particular way something is phrased or an idea may or may not resonate with an audience, or may or may not be appropriate to the form or the purpose of the writing. I feel that kind of making it less about the student's characteristics or approach, and more about what's the purpose of writing, what are we writing to do. So I appreciate this question. I think there are a number of pieces of language strengths, asking questions, kind of depersonalizing the critical feedback, being clear and consistent with that feedback, and focusing on the purpose, audience, and inform of to whom our students writing. In our undergraduate programs, we also have, or in our undergraduate applied studies programs, all of them are also WEC programs, writing enriched curriculum programs. So there's some additional guidance in terms of how each of these programs think about the audience. What are the contours of the audience for, say, construction management industry versus health services management. So I think those kind of nuances in industry are reflected in those writing enriched curriculum plans as well. Are there final thoughts our panelists would like to share? We'll close up our panel and then take a little break and then go into our instructor lounge. So before we do that, final thoughts, big ideas that you'd like to share?
I think one is just like sometimes students don't, and especially if they're coming from different cultures or working through different languages, like don't always understand the feedback and like what is meant by it. Or so I think just as much clarity as we can have, it takes more time, right, to write like a full sentence versus like a quick note. But if we're doing quick notes, then is there like a glossary that they can go look at, or is there something to like really explain that they can? And I mean, of course, they can come ask questions, but that's not always feasible in the moment or something. So I'm teach a lot of asynchronous classes, and so I'm thinking about like that time lag sometimes. But anyways, being mindful of the language that we're using, and making sure things like are embedded, like it would be a good idea, or you should, like just kind of these like sort of embedded language that can be kind of complex to understand.
All right,
I don't
then.
really have anything else to add, but I will say this, that it's not always true in all courses, but if you're in a situation where your assignments are never wrong, in other words, you cannot have a wrong answer. I really like questions like that build on ambiguity. So if they know that there's not a wrong answer, that gives them a little comfort. Then we're just looking at the best way to articulate a response, because there's, better responses, maybe there's things like that you can bring in. That is what, at least in my field, the industry is going to tell you, or you're going to find out the hard way what was not a good response. But I think except obviously when we deal with empirical numbers and stuff like that. Having assignments that are not wrong, no matter what you do, is helpful as a starting point. And then you can see how you can make it better.
I really like that. I think students often have very dichotomous thinking, like I'm good at this, or I'm bad at this, or I got it right, or I got it wrong. And if you can design assignments to get them out of that dichotomous thinking, I think you're probably doing them a favor, particularly for students who struggle and who think, I'm not a math person or I'm not a writing person. Well, everybody's a math person and everybody's a writing person. And we all struggle with different kinds of things. It doesn't come easily to anyone. Giving opportunities for students to get some both partial success and productive failure, I think that's really, really useful. That'd be a sign of a well-organized class for me.
I just have a quick kind of reaction to it, because I feel like I love the idea of not being wrong, and then I wonder what it means in a grading. Like, can a student, if the question or the assignment is there's no really wrong answer, but there is an A and a C, right? And so then if I didn't do a wrong answer but I got a C, then what is there something? What was the expectation? So I'm clear. I love the idea if the grading can align with that idea as well, because otherwise I feel like then there's something, or there's a rubric that makes it really clear, like what makes there's no wrong answer, but there are strong ways of arguing an answer, or whatever it is. And then that needs to be really clear, because that's part of, I think, maybe what Bree's talking about with the hidden curriculum too, is like, okay, there's no wrong answer, but there is one that's better than so I don't know. I'm just like, that's a hard space to be in, even if it's, yeah, anyways.
Yep. No, I think that speaks to something Sherry said in the chat about designing rubrics around what is it that students are doing successfully, rather than designing around what's perfection and what's less than that. So if you begin designing a rubric by asking the questions, what are the minimum things a student needs to do to be able to successfully complete the assignment, and set that as sort of the middle benchmark, and then think, okay, what can a student do that would be better than simply meeting those expectations? So I'm imagining for Peter, it might be providing a design with some kind of rationale could meet that medium expectation, that you've got a design, you've got an explanation for it. It could be that your design will collapse, and that's definitely not good news. Or it could be that your rationale is ill-informed. That's definitely not good news. So within those categories, right, once we establish what is the minimum expectation, we can then think about what are those praiseworthy things that lead us to the A's and B's categories, and then what are the problems or failures that can lead us into those C, D, F categories.
I would also say that the focus of the assessment would be more on depth and breadth of thinking, as opposed to necessarily what was actually written. So did you have a really broad way of thinking about this, and that you articulated it that way? Or did you just sort of put the least amount in there that would get the answer that you thought I was looking for, but didn't think about it? I want to see what's turning in their heads, because I know after they get that thought process down, eventually they're going to get the way to articulate it well. It's going to come from the School of Hard Knocks, which comes after the University of Minnesota.
Well, thank you all. And what I'm hearing is that while perhaps there's an opportunity for many right answers, and how do we teach students around there being many right answers? How do we offer them that kind of feedback on their subjective personal views on maybe challenges that are complex, maybe a lot of issues that our industries face? There's not one right answer. There are multiple pathways or multiple right answers. So helping students to make sense of all of those possibilities, but also to make meaning of their own perception and opportunities to create change or to understand the dynamics of their industry. So thank you all for participating in our panel.